Suzanne. I've been in real estate for 13 years.
We're out retracing Brad Simpson's steps today based on the locations laid out in the affidavit from last week.
There's people there, there's cameras there. There's no way you could dump a body or evidence without people noticing you.
My hope is that Brad will do the right thing and come forward and tell us everything he knows so that we can end this awful ordeal.
All right, so we are joined now by John Hunter and Jonathan Chavez, both criminal defense attorneys here in Bexar County, which San Antonio is in Bexar County. And both of them had interesting cases in the past. And I wanted you to talk a little bit at first about the Andre McDonald case that you were both in.
Yeah, Jonathan and I both got the pleasure to represent Andre McDonald, who was also charged with murder of his wife, Andreen. I came into the case kind of late in its progression. It was a case that was being headed up by a dear friend of both of ours, John Convery. And John was working with Jonathan and also with another wonderful lawyer that we deeply admire, Zoe Russell, who'd been working the case for a couple of years before I joined on to help them with it. And then we tried it back in, what was that, 2023. It was an interesting case because it began as a case that had no body. There was a search for Andreen. She was missing for a great period of time. And then a body was ultimately discovered. Her skeletal remains were found up in rural northern Bexar County. And then that changed the dynamics of what the case was about. And then it yet again changed its character significantly because we were very focused on both the fact that it was a circumstantial evidence case. There was no real smoking gun that established how Andreen had died or exactly what the circumstances of it were. A lot of it was murky. The state was largely hedging its bets on the fact that a great deal of the evidence that they had found in Andre's home was of a character that might suggest that someone was trying to dispose of a body or tamper with evidence in that kind of a way. And so we focused a lot of our efforts on the Fourth Amendment. We were really deeply concerned about the way that Bexar County had investigated the case, the tools that they used to try and reach into Andre's home, both without a warrant and using information warrantlessly obtained to get warrants to search his home and his effects. We had a 3-day motion to suppress on that. And at the end of it, we lost a large chunk of what we were complaining about in front of the judge. And Andre called his family, called Andreen's parents to let them know that, in fact, he had killed her, but that it had been an accident. It was something that had occurred while they were fighting. He maintained that Andreen had attacked him and that he was defending himself. And ultimately, he was acquitted of murder, but convicted of manslaughter. And that issue, the issues in that case are still on appeal. So some of this is, stuff that I can't talk about in too much detail. But suffice it to say that that's where things left off for Andre McDonald. Chavi, you especially have a lot of insight into the early days of the case. I remember talking to you about it right when it had first happened, when Andreen was still missing.
Yeah, the craziest part of that case is that we start preparing it because it was one of those cases where you knew it was going to go to trial right away. It wasn't something that we were going to work out, both based off just the facts of the case and then our conversations with Mr. McDonald. So we started preparing it for trial right away, but we did start preparing it kind of with no body there. So it was interesting in that I kind of got to see it from both perspectives. Overall, the biggest lesson that I took from McDonald, though, was, we didn't everything that we prepared was the wrong stuff. So it was you can prepare as much as you want, but it's there's going to be things that happen that you didn't even think were possible, maybe a day before. So that is
Quick
the big takeaway
changes.
from that.
very quick changes for you defending somebody, and you had no body, and all of a sudden now you have a body. How quickly did you have to pivot?
Well, on that one, we had a little while to pivot. On as far as the talk conversation with Mr. McDonald after the suppression hearing and before the trial, we had about a weekend before before the trial started to pivot completely.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I ran into one of the senior officials from Bexar County Sheriff's that had investigated the case. This was maybe a year after the trial was over, and he just said, shoot me straight. Did y'all plan this? Was this some strategic thing? And I'm like, well, I wish we were that smart, but I mean, no, we had no idea that that was going to happen. And it was a scramble to try and figure out how we were going to persist in defending it. I mean, over the weekend, it was sort of like, are we going to plead guilty now? I mean, what do we do having, received this information? And, when we actually learned what was communicated and how that all went down, it allowed us to find a strategy to be able to help and actually let Andre tell his story.
Jordan, I know you and I talk about it in the newsroom a lot, how this trial is going to take place. It's been a year now. We just passed the 1 year mark. So how is this trial going to take place? What are your biggest questions that you want to ask him, or both of the attorneys?
Well, they mentioned that a lot of the evidence was circumstantial in that Andre McDonald case. From what we know so far, it seems like that's going to be the case here too. As we gear up for a potential Brad Simpson trial in February, what evidence do you expect to see presented here that maybe we haven't necessarily heard about? Because we got an affidavit with a lot in it, but there is surely more than that we have not seen.
It seems like it's going to also be a circumstantial case, and people should understand there's nothing inherently wrong with a circumstantial case. I mean, people can be found guilty on purely circumstantial evidence. Not every case has a smoking gun or a confession or eyewitness accounts of exactly what took place, or even a body, what we call the corpus delicti of the offense. And so, the things that you see around the circumstances of the actual disappearance, the death, can be probative of what actually took place. And I mean, from what I understand, things related to things that could be used in order to dispose of a body, to cut a body up, were found in places where Mr. Simpson frequented, that he owned. His movements suggested places where perhaps a body could be hidden. And so those are things that obviously the state's going to put a lot of emphasis on. I mean, the flip side of that is, okay, yes, but I mean, each and every one of those things could, under other circumstances, be innocuous, innocent activity. And there are lots of reasons that someone might, acquire certain items or have certain items around. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those things tie up. One person's, cohesive theory of prosecution is another person's, conspiracy theorist bulletin board. And so that's going to be kind of the tug of war that you see between the defense and the prosecution is, do these things all actually link up, or is it coincidental that they do?
What kind of evidence do you think carries the most weight when there is a no body case?
So I was actually going to comment on that real quick. The interesting thing is that usually the state of the body is a big part of how the jury determines whether this was a murder or not, just because that intent and everything goes to that decision. So when you have the body, you can normally have an analysis like it was blunt trauma to the head, what was going on, was there a struggle? You can tell a lot from the body analysis. And then without a body in this case, that'll be the real interesting thing. So honestly, the most interesting and I think important parts to look at are going to be the pieces of evidence that kind of point to any kind of struggle or things like that. It'll be interesting to see how that's shown without without a body or without any remains.
The most important part in the murder case is to establish that there is a cause of death that was brought about by the actor, and that they did that with the requisite mental state, that they did it either intentionally or knowing that it would be the result. And that's hard to do without a body. I mean, even if the circumstances are terrible, even if people overheard them fighting, even if people overheard them threatening each other, that doesn't necessarily tell you whether or not he had a hand in her death. I mean, I'm very fond of an old New York City Police Department manual on homicide investigation that it starts off with a very lengthy chapter called "Is it a homicide?" And it gives these really gruesome photograph examples of people's death that look very suspicious. People that are, in a partial state of undress, for example, and the immediate thing you think of is, oh, it's a sex assault and a murder. And then you come to find out the person died of a heart attack taking off their clothes to get in bed. I mean, it's just like, these things are very, very important because the circumstances can't tell that whole story that the body can. And so it's one of those things where it's going to be a huge challenge. And I mean, I don't know if you all recall the Durst trial that Dick DeGuerin tried several years ago, but he was acquitted. And he maintained that his efforts at destruction of the corpse were because he was afraid of how it would look. And we saw a very similar thing in the Andre McDonald case, that Andre's behavior after the fact he attributed to his panic because it looks terrible. There's a dead person in the house and there's been an argument. That doesn't mean that you're responsible for it, but how do you prove a negative? How do you convince people that that isn't the case?
There was part of the affidavit that I always go back to when I look at it, and they found a note in one of Brad Simpson's phones that is titled "My Last Will and Testament." In that note, he admits that he had assaulted Suzanne Simpson on October 6th, 2024, and then again a previous time. How important do you think that is going to be when he does get in front of a judge? And how might the defense handle something like that?
Yeah, it's a tough thing. I mean, admitting to an assault is not admitting to a murder, but it definitely does place a little bit more weight on the prosecution scale than they would otherwise have. I mean, hard to say. That's pretty tough evidence, but it isn't a confession to the ultimate act. And I mean, an assault. I mean, think about it this way. If you engage in like what would be considered assaultive behavior, which is just simply contact causing pain, you may not have the intent to cause serious bodily injury or death. You may not know that will be the natural and ordinary consequence of what you're doing. And yet it may happen. I mean, and sometimes those cases are very difficult to parse out. I've seen cases go to grand jury and be considered for indictment where there was a bar brawl, for example. And it was very clear from the witnesses that no one was fighting with enough force or aggression that anyone was trying to kill anybody. But someone hits their head and they get a hematoma and they die. And I've seen grand juries no bill murder, indict on negligent homicide or manslaughter under those kinds of conditions. It's very clear that actor wanted to hit the other person. That's an assault, but it may not rise to that same level of intent that's required for first-degree murder. So, I mean, it's bad because it's another circumstance that weighs in favor of the conclusion that he's involved, but it may not be the end of the world for him.
Jonathan, what do you think?
Oh, as far as that, I was going to say that might shed some light on honestly what I will be looking at as a defense attorney, putting forth this evidence. And essentially what I'm talking about is getting the point across. Just because you don't like my client, or just because my client's a jerk doesn't mean he did this. So I know that there's a lot more to that letter than just that to make them think that they wouldn't like him, but that would start to go to, as far as developing, try to how I'm going to present this case. That kind of does shed some light on that, because it does show that there's some stuff out there that's going to make him not a likable person just based off personality. And it's really one of those things you got to start getting that across. Hey, my guy might be a jerk, doesn't mean he did it.
So let me ask you, with that said, I mean, we've heard that the little girl went back and was in the house and had seen things and shared that. The son came into the home later. Are we going to see the children being brought to the stand, or, the questioning that they did with the children being brought to trial?
If they have factual evidence about things that were observed, or if they're the point of origin in a chain of custody for something that's going to be admitted, they may well have to testify to get that in, because someone has to come forward and say, this is the thing I saw, this is where I saw it. Either this is the actual object I'm holding in court, or it's a photograph and it's a true and accurate representation of what I saw, so that it can be admitted. And the way the system works, we just can't take people's word for that. That's an unfortunate consequence of what is a fundamental right of the defendant, which is to confront the people bringing evidence against him, even if it's children, even if it's family.
What would your strategy be right now if you were defending Mr. Simpson?
It's hard to say what the defensive strategy would be, except that it definitely is a situation where you have to start from imagining that the prosecutor is able to produce all of the evidence that's been collected. It all is admitted into evidence. And then you're asking yourself, okay, well, what's missing here? How many pieces of the puzzle are still missing? And how significant are those pieces?
Jonathan, what would your strategy be?
Well, I was gonna say, is the hearing in January, is that there? Because I know that there were some pretty important pretrial motions that were still going to be heard in January. The hard thing is that you kind of have to have a few different strategies ready in a case like this, because those pretrial motions like that, especially on suppression issues and stuff, can change your entire strategy. So right now, I'd probably be preparing like 2 or 3 different strategies going into it, and being prepared to fall back on any one of them. Just because from my understanding, those January hearings are supposed to be pretty important as far as what evidence is going to get in or not get in, or presented before the jury. So right now, I'd probably be preparing for a few different things, but definitely what John said as well.
Well, I was going to say, Chavi, I mean, like, imagine if we had won that 3-day motion to suppress on Andre McDonald. They probably would have still tried him. They just wouldn't have had any of the evidence that they found in his garage or in the car. And maybe they wouldn't have found the blood stain that was in the bathroom. But I mean, just the difference in how strategically you would approach that case if you suppress the evidence that's been violating the Fourth Amendment versus if you don't suppress it. I
mean, on a case, I'm having a really hard time on this case, honestly, because it's a really difficult situation. And I know how difficult it is trying to prepare for the opposition when there's not a body in a case, and it honestly, it feels like there's less of a roadmap when there's not a body than when there is.
Public sentiment in this has already decided that Mr. Simpson is guilty. We have him all over the news, people posting everywhere, talking about it, his own family basically not talking to him. How hard is that going to be for the prosecution? And when you're selecting a jury, how do you go about selecting a jury in Bexar County that's going to be impartial to what you have to say and listen to your defense?
It's a very challenging thing. Media saturation is generally never a good thing for the accused. It it doesn't mean that he's doomed to be convicted just because the court of public opinion has decided that. Because I think that at least there are some people that will be in the pool of potential jurors that can appreciate that what we perceive as the court of public opinion is just sort of the media's point of view. It doesn't represent necessarily everyone's point of view. And there are some people that want to at least give a meaningful challenge to that point of view if they can. And I think in 2025, 2026, that sense of maybe what's reported in the media, whether that be traditional media or social media, is not necessarily representative of reality. And I think people, if they're given the chance to serve on the jury, can be called upon and challenged to come at it from a different point of view and to keep an open mind. As far as filtering out the people who have absolutely made up their mind, right? People who have followed it religiously, who know all the ins and outs of it already, are convinced firmly in his guilt. The law allows the lawyers to ask of the panel of jurors if anyone here, from hearsay or otherwise, is in possession of information that has led them to form a conclusion about the merits of the case. And if people answer yes to that question, they're excused. There's no chance to have them clarify, to qualify their answer. They're just excused because we know that that's an incurable thing. If you've already formed an opinion, then there's no hope in us trying to persuade you differently. You know, I mean, I once tried to return a lawnmower to a hardware store. And I said, at the end of it, fine, I'll just give you the lawnmower and I'll buy a new one. I'm done with this. They wouldn't even take the lawnmower I was offering them for free. If you can't persuade someone of something that simple, you certainly can't persuade someone that's made up their mind by watching the television.
If you were involved in this case, if you were the ones on the defense, would you have moved to move this trial out of Bexar County for these reasons we've been talking about?
It would take a really extraordinary set of circumstances for me to think that transferring a venue is a good idea. Because on the one hand, yes, this population of people have been saturated with this information more extensively than anybody else because it's on their local news and it's on their local newspaper and their push notifications are about these subjects. But by the same token, you know, as the lawyers that practice here, you know, I know Bexar County juries a lot better than I do juries in Atascosa County or Wilson County. I mean, I practiced out there and I've worked with those people as well, but it's a different set of ideas. It's a different set of demographics. It's a different set of political beliefs. And so sometimes it's better to go with the folks you know, even if you're worried that they've been tainted by something that the media has said, than it is to go with a mystery. The other side of that is just that, you know, how far would you have to move it to find? I mean, you'd have to get it out of the geographic reach of, you know, News 4, the KENS 5 KSAT bubble of people that are, you know, watching that news. That's a large county radius. You know, I don't know where you'd have to take it in order to completely evade the local media saturation for it. But then you're running far afield.
Yeah, you'd have to go pretty far. In the last few minutes that we have left, I want to ask both of you something and be honest. Jonathan, we'll start with you. Have you ever had a client that you doubted their innocence, and what do you do?
No, I always believe my clients every single time.
All right, and John Hunter, the same question. I mean, do you doubt, and then what do you do if you know that client is not telling you the truth? You have to think that not all of them give you everything right off the bat when they walk in the door, and as you keep going along.
Honestly, I don't ask my clients ever if they did it or not.
Really?
Yeah. Because if they want to take the stand, I don't want to have to like I don't want to know.
I mean, I certainly recognize where Jonathan's coming from with that point of view, and that's a widely held belief. I don't necessarily agree with it. I think it's important that you try to have enough rapport with your client that if your client is guilty, they confide in you and that they talk to you about it. That doesn't mean that you are going to engage in the conspiracy to suborn perjury. If the defendant wants to testify, the defendant has to come and reconcile to his own nature that the truth has to be received. And that if he can't say something truthful to help him, that maybe he shouldn't testify. That isn't necessarily an infringement on his right. It's just the honest truth about how the law relates to the ethical responsibility of taking the witness stand and having the oath administered. So I try very hard to make sure that my clients are telling me the truth. And I mean, am I successful 100% of the time? No, I'm sure that someone's pulled the wool over my eyes before. I'm sure that some clients have withheld information that would have helped them or would have hurt them. But I think by and large, I've been very lucky in my career that most of the people I've represented have either not told me as their own choice not to tell me, or they've been very candid about what they know, what they did, what they were thinking when they did it. And representing the guilty effectively is just as important as representing the innocent. And just because someone is objectively in the wrong, in other words, they may have done something that is morally wrong, they may have done something that is even legally wrong. That is not the same thing as there being enough proof to take that person's freedom and liberty away from them. That's the state's responsibility. It's not mine. They have to do it beyond a reasonable doubt. And if they can't, then they don't deserve to put that person in prison. Person is entitled to remain presumptively innocent. And that's how I approach it.
I think a lot of times, honestly, you have with domestic violence situations on juries, you have men want to protect women. They actually go to the aid in their minds. They go to the aid of the woman. So a lot of times getting men on your jury, and you never know because everybody's different and each jury is different, but it does actually have that psychology a lot of times that a man will almost like leap to the aid of, the victim, in this case of the woman. So that's actually something that I take into account in a big way on this case. Whereas women a lot of times will analyze everything versus the man that follows that emotion in that sense.
So we want to thank attorney Jonathan Chavez, John Hunter. Jordan, any last thoughts before we end this?
So this is going to go to trial in February. There's another hearing in January that we'll be covering for you, but we'll be keeping an eye on things as it develops as we move closer.